July of 1922, the trains were still moving. That was the strange part. Passengers climbed aboard, freight rolled across the country, and timetables were printed, and conductors called out destinations. To an outsider, America appeared to be fully functioning still, but deep inside the rail yards, the roadhouses, and the repair shops, something had stopped. Nearly 400,000 workers had walked away. Within weeks, there would be shootings, sabotage, armed guards, federal marshals, court orders, and funerals. And at the center of it all stood a question that still feels familiar today. What happens when the people who keep everything running decide that they've had enough? This is the story of the Great Railroad Strike of 1922. Stay tuned for the full story. 1922 arrived quietly enough. There were no warning signs or sirens or dramatic announcements, no single moment when Americans woke up one day and realized they were about to witness one of the largest labor conflicts in the nation's history so far. Instead, the trouble arrived the way that most serious problems do. It arrived one paycheck at a time. For years, railroad workers had carried much of the nation's economic weight on their own shoulders. During World War I, America's railroads had been placed under federal control. The arrangement was far from perfect, of course, but it had created a period of relative stability. Workers gained protections, including an 8-hour workday, which was unusual at the time, and many believed the sacrifices that they had made during the wartime would be remembered once the peacetime returned. Peace, however, had a habit of arriving with its own complications, as it always does. When control of the railroads returned to private companies, the atmosphere completely changed. The economy around them, the economics, shifted. Prices fluctuated. Executives searched for ways to reduce costs. Workers watched their wages shrink, while daily expenses remained stubbornly realistic and the same. A dollar still had to buy a lot of groceries. A dollar still had to pay for rent. And a dollar still had to keep a family warm throughout an entire winter. And in 1921, wage cuts arrived. Workers grumbled, but they endured. Then came another reduction. This seems unfair. In 1922, the Railroad Labor Board approved an additional wage cut of 7 cents an hour for repair and maintenance workers. On paper, especially in today's terms, 7 cents an hour doesn't sound catastrophic, but in real life, it represented roughly 12% of a worker's income. To men already balancing bills and responsibilities, and a lot of times families, it felt like another hand that was reaching into an already thin wallet. And the anger spread slowly at first. Conversations took place in machine shops and rail yards and roundhouses. Men that were working for the railroad discussed the situation during lunch breaks and after long shifts. And eventually, the talk spread beyond the men who worked for the rail yards. But these men who did work for the rail yards compared notes and fears, and they compared pay stubs. And before long, the strike ballots were distributed. And the results were absolutely decisive. On July 1st of 1922, nearly 400,000 railroad workers walked away from their jobs. Machinists left their benches. Boilermakers left their tools. Electricians and blacksmiths and sheet metal workers and laborers all joined them. It became the largest railroad strike since the Pullman strike of 1894 and one of the largest labor actions America had ever seen. Yet something unusual happened too. The trains largely continued moving. The conductors and engineers and firemen and train crews responsible for operating locomotives were not part of the strike. Freight continued to roll across the country and passenger trains continued to arrive at stations. So to an observer standing beside the tracks, everything looked like it was still working the same way it always did. Everything appeared perfectly normal. But appearances can be very deceptive. The railroad industry depended upon maintenance. Locomotives required constant attention. Cars required repairs and equipment wore out. Metal cracks. Bearings fail. Boilers demand inspection. Well, the workers who handled those responsibilities were now standing outside of the gates. Railroad executives, of course, responded as quickly as they could. Replacement workers were hired and housing was established inside of the rail facilities. Guards were recruited to protect property and escort strike breakers. Now, in the credits, at the very, very end, you will see a man sitting on what looks like a soapbox leaning up against a telephone pole. This is one of those security officers who were hired to help protect the property and escort the strike breakers. Very interesting job at the time. He looks like a lone man. That's for a good reason. Newspaper advertisements appeared then, and they started urging the public to really start supporting the companies. And both sides began to fight not only for victory, but also for public opinion. And as the weeks passed, the tensions deepened. In some towns, local communities rallied around the strikers. Merchants quietly extended credit to these people. Families started sharing food. Churches organized support efforts for them. Community picnics raised morale for them. Sheriffs occasionally stepped between armed guards and angry crowds in an effort to prevent the violence. But not everyone viewed the strike in the same lens. Some Americans saw workers who were defending their livelihoods, but others saw a threat to the economic stability. The country itself seemed rightfully divided, and every conversation felt capable of becoming an argument. But then the violence began. A strike involving hundreds of thousands of people spread across thousands of miles. This was always vulnerable to confrontation. The first incidences rarely were relatively small. They were rare at first. They were just heated arguments and threats and damaged property, maybe some broken windows. But soon those incidents became something much more scary and much more dangerous. They became shootings. Armed guards hired by railroad companies exchanged fire with several strikers in several states. Men died in Ohio. Men died in New York, in New Jersey. A teenage boy was killed in Illinois. In Buffalo, New York, a woman and 2 boys were caught in the gunfire. The newspapers carried their stories, and families carried their grief. But this woman and her 2 boys carried nothing at all. They weren't even a part of this. But the conflict grew increasingly bitter. Tracks were sabotaged and strikebreakers were threatened with their lives or their families' lives. Railroad property was damaged and trains occasionally became targets of angry crowds. Vigilante attacks occurred in some regions. That's never a good thing, people. Union leaders publicly condemned violence, but controlling the actions of thousands of frustrated people across an entire continent is pretty much nearly impossible, even now. Meanwhile, the federal government watched with a growing concern. President Warren G. Harding himself found himself trapped between competing pressures. Some advisors urged negotiation. Others demanded that they take force. Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover favored compromise. Attorney General Harry Daugherty favored confrontation. Daugherty saw the strike not merely as a labor dispute, but as a challenge to governmental authority. His language became increasingly severe as time went. Federal marshals entered the conflict, and the government's role expanded dramatically. For a brief moment, a peaceful solution appeared possible, but only briefly. Harding attempted to position himself as an honest broker. So the meetings were arranged and discussions took place. Railroad representatives and union officials sat together. I'm also going to have a picture of these 3 men in the credits as well. They're going to have the American flag draped on the wall behind them. They'll be in the lower corner down here. So look for that. Compromises were proposed at some of these meetings. Workers desperately hoped for some kind of progress. But one issue repeatedly destroyed the negotiations: a thing called seniority. To railroad workers, seniority was not a technical detail. It was determined by promotions and job security and future opportunities. But railroad companies increasingly sought to strip striking workers of seniority rights. Workers viewed this as a demand, as an attempt to punish them permanently for deciding to stand up for themselves. And neither side was going to yield. So the deadlock continued. As summer stretched onward, exhaustion settled over everyone involved. Families struggled financially. Communities grew really quite weary. Railroad companies absorbed massive losses. Workers watched their savings completely disappear. The strike increasingly resembled a long siege in which everyone suffered and no one advanced. But then came the decisive blow. On September 1st, Judge James Herbert Wilkerson issued a sweeping federal injunction. Its impact was enormous. The order restricted picketing, organizing, assembling, and many traditional union activities. Critics viewed it as one of the most aggressive anti-labor judicial actions in American history. Supporters argued it restored order. Whatever one's opinion might be, the practical effect was undeniable. The strike began to collapse. Some workers returned individually. Others negotiated local agreements. Many reluctantly accepted the terms that they had once completely dismissed as being unacceptable. The movement had begun with 400,000 workers, but it gradually unraveled. By autumn, the strike was effectively over. Yet endings can be misleading as much as appearances. The workers had not achieved the victory that they sought. Many of them lost their jobs, and many lost their seniority. Many carried resentment for many years afterward. The railroad companies won the immediate battle, but the political consequences proved to be far more complicated. The Harding administration faced criticism from multiple directions. Business leaders thought the administration had hesitated a little bit too long, but labor supporters believed that the government had sided with the railroads. Public confidence in the administration suffered. In the elections that followed, Republicans experienced significant losses, and so the Great Railroad Strike of 1922 entered history not just for what happened to the railroad, but also for what happened to politics. Not as a story of clear heroes and villains, though, and not as a story of total victory or of complete defeat, but instead it became a story about power, work, dignity, and the basic difficult question that sits beneath every labor dispute. How much is stability worth, and who pays the price for it? The men who walked off those railroad jobs were not trying to become historical figures. Most simply wanted to support their families. The executives who opposed them believed that they were protecting the future of their own companies, and the politicians caught between them hoped that the crisis would disappear before it damaged the nation. None of them received exactly what they wanted. Perhaps that's why the story feels a little bit familiar more than a century later, because the details change, the industries change, the technology changes, but the question remains remarkably the same. And that is how often history tends to happen. What do you think leaves a deeper mark on the nation, the victories that people celebrate, or the defeats that force people to rethink what might come next? Don't forget to leave your comments on the Facebook post or on the YouTube post. And if you happen to check this video out on a podcast, make sure you leave a podcast review if you're so inclined, if you enjoy this show. And I'll see you tomorrow.